I had learned the Genesis transmission schedule from von Rellstab's radio operator, so I knew on what channel and at what times the Genesis 4 would listen, and so at nightfall I went below and turned on Stormchild's big radio. Jackie, at the wheel, peered anxiously down the companionway as I tuned the radio, and as at last I pressed the transmitter button. "Stormchild calling Genesis 4. This is Stormchild calling Genesis 4. Over." Nothing. A great wave rolled past our flank, and I heard the sea scouring down the scuppers. "Stormchild calling Genesis 4. This is Stormchild calling Genesis 4. Over." Still nothing. I sat at the console smelling the pervasive smell of the diesel oil that still reeked in the saloon carpet. "Stormchild calling Genesis 4. This is Stormchild calling Genesis 4. Come in, please. Over." Were the Chileans listening? Was the Armada monitoring all the medium and high-frequency channels in an effort to find us and intercept us? If they thought I was trying to help my daughter evade their country's justice, then the Chilean Navy might very well have a lean grey patrol vessel somewhere in this wilderness of sea and wind. Yet, I reasoned, the Armada would surely talk to me on the radio if they had intercepted that transmission, and so far neither they nor Genesis 4 had replied. Perhaps no one was listening. I pressed the key again. "Stormchild calling Genesis 4. This is Stormchild calling Genesis 4. Over." "We hear you," said the voice from the speaker, and it said nothing more. Just those 3 words, "We hear you." But it was my daughter's voice, curt and toneless, and I stared at the radio as though it had just transmitted the word of God. "Nicole?" I transmitted in wonderment. "Nicole?" But there was no reply, and I realized that though my daughter might listen to me, she had nothing to say in return. So be it. I closed my eyes, pressed the key, and spoke. I began by saying that I loved her. It sounded stilted, so I said it again, and afterwards I told her I knew what she had done, not just to her mother, but to the Australian crew of the Naiad, and I said that the evidence of her deeds had been given to her Uncle David, who was making sure that evidence reached the proper authorities. I then explained that the Genesis community had ceased to exist. Its leaders were dead, its members were homeless, and its settlement was destroyed. "You can sail back there now and you'll find the Chilean police and navy waiting for you. Or you can rendezvous with me, and we'll either go back together or sail to the Falklands. I'm not offering you freedom, just a choice between British or Chilean justice. I would also like to meet you and tell you that I still love you, even if I hate what you've done." My words still sounded lame, but the truth so often limps off the tongue in times of crisis. Just when we most need to speak with the tongues of angels, we stumble with uncertain words. "I'm sailing southwards now," I told Nicole, "and I'll clear the Cape in 6 or 7 days. If you meet me, I'll escort you to wherever you want to go, and I'll do my best to find you an honest and good lawyer." I paused. "And I love you, Nicole." I waited, but there was no reply. "Nicole!" I begged the sky, but still no word came back. I left the radio switched on, and its speaker turned full up as I went back to the cockpit, but no voice broke the hissing silence. If Nicole was going to accept my offer, then she was accepting it in silence. "She said nothing?" Jackie asked. "Only that she could hear me." Jackie bit her lip, then gave me a decisive look. "I've been thinking about it, Tim, and I know it's going to be all right. Nicole must know she's got nothing to gain by hurting you. She knows it's over, doesn't she?" "Yes." "And she's not a fool, Tim," Jackie said passionately. "She probably won't even look for us. I mean, the only choice you've offered is between a British and a Chilean jail, so she's much more likely to sail west, isn't she, to try and lose herself in the Pacific?" "She might," I admitted. "She very well might." But somehow I didn't think that Nicole would resist this final confrontation, and I suddenly wished I'd not let Jackie share it with me. I wished I was not driven to the confrontation myself, for by facing my daughter I risked my new happiness in exchange for an old relationship that could never be restored. In the early hours of darkness the wind backed into the east, a sure sign that it would freshen. Jackie and I took in 2 reefs, and I was glad we did, for within the hour the wind was shrieking in the rigging as we slogged southwards on a long port tack. Every slam of the bows reverberated through the steel hull and rattled the crockery in the galley, and shivered the floating compass card in the cockpit's binnacle. White spray slashed back to spatter on the spray hood. I sent Jackie below to rest, and noted that instead of finding a snug refuge in the forward cabin, she took her bag into the after cabin, where my own things were stored. Yet she must have found it hard to sleep, for shortly after midnight she came back on deck. The ship was dark as sin, for I was sailing without any navigation lights, and the stars were cloud-shrouded, so that the only illumination in our whole world was the tiny, unobtrusive red glow of the instrument lights. Jackie groped her way to my side, then snapped her lifeline to the D-ring at the base of the wheel's pedestal. As her night vision came, she saw the sliding avalanches of white water that rushed beside our gunwales, and the sight made her tremble. "Doesn't it frighten you?" she asked, and I realized that this was her first experience of cold, gale-force sailing. I smiled in the darkness. "O Lord," I quoted her the fisherman's ancient prayer, "my boat is so small and thy sea is so big, protect me." "That's nice," she said softly. "Besides," I gave the wheel a twitch, "you should be cautiously afraid of the sea. A wise old fisherman once said that a man who isn't afraid of the sea will soon be drowned, for he'll go out on a day when he shouldn't sail. But those of us who are afraid of the sea only get drowned every now and again." She laughed, then was silent for a good long while. Perhaps the mention of drowning had put the thought of Nicole into Jackie's mind, for she suddenly asked just where I thought we would meet Nicole, if we met her at all. "I know just where she'll meet us," I said, because I had thought this whole rendezvous through, and I knew the exact place to which Nicole was even now racing in her fast catamaran. "She'll be waiting at the Horn." "The Horn?" Jackie echoed the two words, and I heard the wonder in her voice, as though she could not truly believe that we were really going to that hell of a seaway where the big ships died and where the ghosts of sailormen never rested. We were sailing to Cape Horn. There are plenty of terrible seas on Earth. I would not lightly sail the Agulhas current off the African coast again, for there the sea shudders in a perpetual rage, and its sudden watery chasms can break the steel spines of the hugest vessels. I wouldn't willingly sail the North Cape again, for there the ice storms howl out of a white desert, and the rigging freezes, and even boats seem to get tired of fighting the savagery of that weather. Yet neither of those places, nor even the storms of the Tasman or the shallow hell of a North Sea winter storm, can rival the bitter fame of Cape Horn. Now, racing southwards with two reefs tied in our mainsail, Jackie and I were already in the Cape's feed chute. Far beyond our eastern horizon, the tip of South America bent ever more sharply towards the Atlantic, thus forming the northern lip of a funnel that compressed and savaged the great Pacific waves that had been fetched across 15,000 miles of roaring ocean, and which were there forced to squeeze themselves into the shallow gap between Cape Horn and Antarctica. That gap was the Drake Passage, the coldest, roughest, and most savage waterway on Earth. A sober man, a prudent man, would have taken the Straits of Magellan, but I would round the Horn, as I had first rounded it 18 years before. Back then, fighting for a record, I had creamed past the Horn, running west to east, and cutting the corner close enough to see the flag flying at the small naval post that the Chileans maintained on the Isla de Hornos. My boat had flogged through wind-lashed spray, plunged through the Horn's steep seas, then disappeared northwards towards Plymouth, home, and the ephemeral glories of a world record. Now, with Jackie, I would visit the Cape again, but this time to save a soul. Each cold morning I searched the sea for a sign of a strange sail that waited to intercept us, but all that week, as Stormchild neared the Horn, we sailed alone. The wind was cold and unrelenting, the seas gargantuan and dark, and the horizon empty. Then, at dawn on the 7th day, just as I was beginning to believe that Nicole had spurned my offer of help, I saw, off to our south, a scrap of something pale against the dark water and hideous black clouds. I seized the binoculars and trained them forward, but could make out no details of the far-off boat, yet I knew I'd seen a sail which waited to meet us at the very place where Stormchild must turn eastward to run the treacherous waters of the Drake Passage. I couldn't be certain yet, but a pursuit that had begun with a photograph in an English Sunday newspaper seemed about to end in the biggest seas God makes. Jackie, who had the eyesight of a starving hawk, came up from the galley and took the binoculars from me. "It's a catamaran," she said after a while. Then she clung desperately to a stay as a huge sea thundered and foamed under Stormchild's counter. The seas here were vast, carrying an ocean's pent-up violence into battle against two continents. Genesis 4, if the strange catamaran was indeed Genesis 4, sailed northwest to meet us, and a half-hour after I had first spotted the strange sail, I could make out the twin hulls flying across the crests of the waves to spew a double coxcomb of high white spray in her wake. The far boat was quick as lightning, and as mute as the grave. I attempted to talk to the catamaran on the VHF, but there was no reply. I went back topsides and tried to calm the idiot excitement that was fusing my emotions. I didn't know if I was glad or miserable, only that my daughter was close, and I felt full of love and forgiveness. I wanted to cry, but instead I hunched down from the freezing wind and felt Stormchild's steel hull tremble nervously in the pounding seas. Those seas were building as they came to their battlefield. The wind was also veering to the west, piling the seas up higher and bringing wicked squalls of black rain, which, when they struck, blotted the distant catamaran from our view. The wind, as well as veering, was rising, and the glass was falling, which meant the weather would probably turn even nastier. "Another reef?" Jackie shouted at me. "I'll drop the main altogether," I shouted back. For the last few minutes, Stormchild had been heeling so far over that her port gunwale had permanently streamed with green water, and her boom, despite being close-hauled, had sometimes drawn a gash of white foam in the flanks of a leeward wave. I should have reefed a half-hour before, but now I would lose the main entirely and depend on our No. 3 jib to pull us through the Drake Passage. Jackie took the wheel while I, wearing twin lifelines, struggled to kill the big mainsail. And it was a struggle, for we were suddenly in a place of shortening and steepening seas that made Stormchild's motion violently unpredictable. I staggered about the deck to gather in the billowing wet canvas. Spray was being sliced and shredded from the wave-tops to mingle with the cold, sleety rain that whipped eastward in the rising wind. I tamed the sail, tied it down, then, fearing the rising malevolence of the seas, I bolted the storm plates over the coach roof windows. "I haven't seen the catamaran for 20 minutes!" Jackie shouted when I returned to the cockpit, and the strange boat had indeed vanished somewhere in the welter of spray and rain. "Go to 150! I shouted to her. I was turning Stormchild back to the southeast, to the course we'd been running when the catamaran first saw us. For a second, I was tempted to try Stormchild's radar, but I knew the storm-lashed seas would clutter the screen and hide the catamaran among a chaos of confused echoes bounced back from the sharp wave peaks. Instead, I stared south, wondering whether, after all, Nicole and I would now miss each other because of this rising gale that screamed across the sea to make the windward slopes of the waves into maelstroms of scummy foam and broken white water. Those waves, monstrous after their 15,000-mile journey, were crashing in from our starboard side to give us a roller coaster ride. When we were on the wave crests, it seemed as though we were surrounded by stinging whips of foam that streamed past our bows and smashed home on our starboard flank and filled the sky with white droplets thick as fog. Beneath us, the troughs sometimes looked like sudden holes in the ocean, with streaked, glossy sides of darkest green, and it seemed inevitable that we would soon topple sideways into one of those great water caverns, and there be buried by a collapsing wave. But Stormchild always slid past them to plunge down the next wave's slope. She left a quick white wake that broke into creamy bubbles before it was overwhelmed by the grey spill of broken foam from the wave crests. In the troughs, the wind's noise would be noticeably muted, but then we would see the next crinkling, heaving, swelling and overpowering wave coming to assail our starboard flank, and it seemed impossible that the tons of water would not break to smash down on our mast and sail and deck. But instead we would heave up to the wind-blown summit, from where I would stare anxiously ahead for a glimpse of my daughter's boat. If indeed it was Nicole we had seen and not some other catamaran thrashing up this lonely coast. After an hour in which no other sail appeared, I decided that the strange sail had indeed been some other ocean voyager and not Nicole at all. I took the wheel from Jackie, who, eschewing a chance to shelter from the wind's cold blast by going below, stayed with me in the cockpit. I'd collapsed the spray hood to save it from being destroyed by the wind's fury, so that the two of us stared with salt-stung eyes into the blinding spray as we searched the mad chaos of wave-tops for another sight of the catamaran. It seemed to have got much colder, and despite the season, freezing rain was now mixing with the spindrift. I had a towel scarf tight round my neck, my oilskin hood was raised and its drawstrings tied, but even so, trickles of near-freezing water were finding their way through the defences to run chill down my chest. Jackie must have been similarly afflicted, but she made no complaint. Indeed, neither of us spoke, and I think we were both so frozen and so tired that we were beginning not to care about the missing boat. I even wondered if the strange sail had been a hallucination brought on by the strain of endlessly fighting the cold. My muscles were cramped and stiff, my thought processes glazed, and my corrections to Stormchild's helm were sluggish and clumsy. Jackie shouted something. The wind snatched her words away, and it took me an immense effort of will to turn my head, thus dislodging the temporarily satisfactory arrangement of towels, sweaters, and oilskins, just to stare blankly at her. She was gazing forward, her mouth open, her eyes huge. I turned to follow her gaze, then swore, because, like a shark slicing into attack, or like a weapon aimed at our heart, the strange catamaran was riding up the southern flank of the wave on which Stormchild was poised. The catamaran was sailing under a scrap of storm jib and a close-reefed main, but was still travelling at racing speed. She was so close that I could see the pattern of her blue and yellow curtains through her small cabin windows. I could even read the name, Naiad, that had been painted over, but which still showed as ghost lettering under the hull's pale green paint. I gaped at the boat, aware suddenly of my racing heart. Then abruptly the catamaran turned north to run past our flank, and I saw 4 figures in her cockpit, and I knew that one was my long-lost child. "Nicole!" I waved like a mad thing. "Nicole!" I shouted, and my voice was lost in the appalling sound of wind and sea and rain and flogging sailcloth. "My God!" Jackie screamed, and I suddenly realized that the flogging sound was not sailcloth, but bullets that were smacking across our jib. I didn't move. I was staring at the figure who stood at the catamaran's wheel, and who suddenly pushed back her oilskin's hood to reveal her bright corn-gold hair and blue eyes. "Nicole!" I shouted as the catamaran, its twin wakes spewing quick foam, slashed up the wave slope we'd just sailed down. The wheel spun neglected in my hands, so that Stormchild bridled, jarred sickeningly, then fell off the wind, as the catamaran finally vanished across the crest behind us. My last glimpse was of Nicole's figure, tall and straight, and the name Genesis 4 painted in crude black letters on the catamaran's starboard transom. Jackie pummeled my arm. "There were 2 of them firing at us! 2 of them!" I had not noticed the gunman, only Nicole. Why shoot at us, I wondered. Why? I was their best hope in a world that would hate them. I was their last chance of love, and they wanted to kill me? "Tim!" Jackie shouted at me, trying to snap me out of my reverie. "Go below," I told her. "Get on the VHF, Channel 37. Tell her we've come to help her. Tell her I love her." I did love her, too. and suddenly my memory registered that Nicole had not just looked at me as her catamaran sliced past Stormchild, but that she had smiled at me. "Oh, God!" I said the prayer aloud, but could not finish it. I was shaking. I was thinking of Nicole's smile. It had been one of recognition, almost pleasure. Sweet Jesus, but what evil was in us! I had thought to meet her and to sail with her to where we could talk, but my child had no time for remorse or reunion. She wanted me dead, and I didn't know why. Was it because I had destroyed Genesis, or was she so steeped in blood that my death meant nothing more to her? I didn't know. I only knew that I was in the worst sea on earth and pursued by madness. Stormchild was lying on her side, shaking and pounding in the seas. Her head had fallen off the wind, and her one sail was dragging her further round, and so I snatched the wheel back and hardened her up into the wind and sea. We were in the foam-ribbed trough of a wave. Then, as the hull began to move again, we laboured slowly up the next vast slope, and I glanced behind just in time to see the vengeful menace of Genesis 4's twin prows, sharp as lances, spear up over the crest behind, then drop to slide down the wave in Stormchild's wake. I heard a popping noise and looked up to see another line of ragged holes rip and tear across Stormchild's jib. Why? I wondered. Then I thought, to hell with the why. Jackie and I would be dead within minutes if I didn't do something. The catamaran was twice as fast as Stormchild and carried twice as many guns. It was no good leaning on sentiment now. I had to fight back, and so I whipped a lashing onto the wheel, slithered across the cockpit, then yanked up the locker lid to find the gun. A bullet clanged off our gunwale and whined up to the clouds. I turned, worked the rifle's bolt, aimed at the catamaran's closest hull, and fired. Nicole had been overtaking Stormchild's starboard flank. Her boat's superior speed gave her the weather gauge, and she could choose her angle and come as close as she liked. Yet suddenly, as I returned the fire and worked the rifle's bolt to fire again, my daughter showed a scrap of good sense and veered her course sharply away from Stormchild and my rifle. "They're not answering the radio!" Jackie shouted, then gave an involuntary scream as a bullet ripped through the coach roof. There were 2 gunmen in the Genesis 4's cockpit. I recognized one of them as Dominic, Nicole's blonde lover, and he seemed to smile as he opened fire again. I heard the sharp crack as his bullets struck our steel hull. Then I saw a jagged rent splay open in the metal boom above my head. Another strike of bullets whipped foam from the dark heart of the wave beyond the cockpit. I fired back, but the Lee Enfield was a slow, clumsy weapon compared with the assault rifles in Nicole's boat. Nor was I aiming to kill, but simply to drive them away. Stormchild, her wheel lashed now, sliced through the broken crest of another wave. The Genesis 4 had gone past us and was now racing far ahead of our slower hull. Her 2 gunmen ceased fire, and I knew we would have a few moments' peace, because Nicole, sailing ahead of us into the shrieking gale, would not dare jib her boat, but would instead have to tack the Genesis 4 back into our path. I guessed we wouldn't see her for 15 minutes. I went below. The cabin was unusually dark because of the storm shields on the windows, and in that unnatural gloom I could see 3 sparks of daylight where bullets had punched through the hull. I had a sudden terror that Jackie had been hit, and whirled round to see her hunched over the radio consoles. I shouted her name. She didn't move. Then I saw she was wearing earphones so as to hear better through the gale's turmoil. "They won't answer." She at last saw me and took off the earphones. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I'm okay. We won't see them for at least 10 minutes, I promised Jackie, because even Nicole isn't crazy enough to jib a boat in this bitch of a wind. I took the microphone and pressed its transmission button. "Nicole! Nicole!" There was silence, except for the sea's maniacal fury thundering beyond our steel hull. Stormchild shuddered in a wave, slid through a screaming horror of foam, then jarred sickeningly into a trough. "Nicole!" I called. "Nicole, for God's sake, this is your father! I'm trying to help you!" Nothing. Emptiness. Silence. I glanced back up the companionway to where the rain slanted down out of a grey-black sky. At times, as Stormchild rolled off a wave, I would see a vast, cold sea toppling behind us, and against it the bomb-riddled ensign would look shatteringly bright. "Nicole!" I pleaded into the radio. But she wasn't listening. Or maybe she was listening, but just refusing to talk to me. And I knew I had just 10 minutes to touch some old nerve of affection in my daughter. Or else she would come back, she would kill us, and then she would sail away to take her chances among the far, anonymous Pacific Islands. "Nicole," I said to her, "I love you. I love you. I love—" I stopped because a terrible, harsh battle percussion was filling Stormchild, and I twisted, aghast, to see more holes being punched in the far side of the saloon. And I knew that Nicole had done the unimaginable, that she had jibbed her boat in this awful gale. She was a better sailor than I, and she had a crack crew, and she had turned her boat in front of this ship-killing wind, and she had done it to prove she was a better sailor than I, and that was why Jackie and I had to die in this awful place. Suddenly it was all so clear. We had to die so that my daughter could prove she was a better sailor than her father. A bullet ricocheted into the galley. Another clanged through the stove's stainless steel chimney. Water pulsed through the bullet holes as Stormchild dipped to the wind. Jackie screamed. I ran topsides and clipped on my lifeline. I worked the rifle's bolt, but the Lee Enfield was puny against our enemy's automatic fire, and Stormchild's slow hull was no match for the speed of my daughter's twin keels, and my seamanship, God help me, was not a patch on hers. At that moment, as I watched the slicing hulls come straight at us, I knew that Nicole was going to kill us. She would do it to prove that she was the better sailor, and so she was, I thought, as I stared at the approaching boat that flicked so lightly through the spume and sea scum. The 2 gunmen were using the cabin top as a firing step. The 3rd crew member was by the sheet winches, while Nicole, bareheaded and happy, stood tall at the helm beneath the strange sea-green ensign of Genesis. Nicole did indeed look happy. She'd taken our measure, and now she would win because she was more daring than her father. The Genesis 4 was sliding towards us down the face of a wave. Stormchild was on the opposing face. We would meet in the trough. Once again, Nicole held the weather advantage, but this time, throwing caution to the wind, she would use it to come so close that her gunmen could not possibly miss. They would pour their fire into Stormchild's cockpit, riddling it with ricocheting bullets to overwhelm our cockpit drains with blood. Jackie, terrified of the clangor of bullets down below, had come to crouch beside me. She frowned at my gun, perhaps wondering why I didn't fire it, but I knew the rifle wouldn't help me now. Genesis 4 seemed to leap through the water, eager to bring us our death. I laid the gun down in the cockpit and smiled at Jackie. "Hold tight," I told her, for I had chosen to outdare my daughter. I stood up straight, not caring about the gunman's bullets, and I stared at my daughter. If I didn't beat her now, then Jackie would die, and I would die, and Stormchild would sink to join the legions of Cape Horn's dead. "Hold on!" I shouted to Jackie, and with fingers numbed by the cold, I unlashed Stormchild's wheel. Christ, but the catamaran was close. Jackie held my arm, and I could feel her shaking and shivering. And no wonder, for the catamaran was scarce 40 yards away now. Nicole, braced at its wheel, was aiming to slide her starboard hull just inches from our starboard gunwale, and at that range, and despite the jarring of the seas pounding, the Genesis community's last gunman couldn't miss. Nicole doubtless expected me to turn away and run downwind, and when I did, she would follow. I could see her winch handler poised to loosen the jib sheets, and I knew that the moment I turned to run, then the catamaran would pounce on us like a striking snake. And then we would die, and Nicole would take her chance for freedom in some far warm sea. But there was another way, and I chose it. I dropped the wheel's lashing, and when Genesis 4 was just 20 yards away, I spun the spokes to drive Stormchild's tons of steels straight at the speeding catamaran. I saw Nicole's eyes widen in alarm. She shouted in anger and snatched at the wheel to turn away, but she was too late. The 2 gunmen clutched for support at a handrail on the cabin roof, and one of their 2 guns skidded into the scuppers and bounced overboard. Then I was shouting at Jackie to hold on for her dear, sweet life. Someone screamed. I think it was my daughter, because she knew I'd beaten her. Stormchild slammed into the turning catamaran. We smashed her starboard hull, breaking it into splinters of fiberglass. A wire stay whipped skywards. The catamaran's mainsail was suddenly demented, filling a noisy sky with its maniacal thrashing. Then, inevitably, the Genesis 4's mast began to topple. I saw Dominic whirl round, face bloody, as the catamaran's severed backstay whipped its frayed metal strands across his eyes. The mast was cracking and falling, and still Stormchild was driving into the catamaran's belly like a great killing axe. I heard the tortured screech of steel on steel as our sharp bows slammed into the main beam that spanned the catamaran's twin hulls. I staggered with the impact, while Jackie, her fingers hooked like claws, clung to my arm. Stormchild's forestay snapped, slashing our jib into the ship-killing wind. A sea thundered across our joined decks, sweeping gear off Genesis 4's scuppers and filling Stormchild's cockpit with a crashing, icy whirlpool. Our bows churned sickeningly in the wreckage of the catamaran. I was sobbing for my daughter, for what I had done. The great sea turned us broadside on, thrusting our stern eastwards. Our bows were trapped by the catamaran's broken hulls. I threw off Stormchild's jib sheet as the 2 boats screeched on each other, but our boat was afloat and the Genesis 4 was breaking apart. Already the catamaran's cockpit was awash and her starboard hull under water. A blue and yellow curtain floated free of the shattered saloon. Stormchild's mast was swaying horribly, but her backstays and shrouds were holding it upright, and the damage would have to wait. "Life, boys!" I shouted at Jackie. I could see 2 yellow-jacketed bodies clinging to the catamaran's wreckage, and I could see a 3rd person in the foam-scummed water beyond. I couldn't see Nicole. The catamaran's mast had collapsed to trail the reefed mainsail and a tangle of lines in the foaming sea. "Nicole!" I shouted, then hurled 2 lifebuoys into the wreckage. I slashed with my knife at the bindings of Stormchild's life raft, and Jackie helped me push the big canister overboard. Another thunderous sea crashed cold across the 2 boats, and when it had passed, I saw that the 2 men who'd been clinging to the wreckage were gone. I pulled the life raft's lanyard and watched as the bright orange raft began to inflate. Another toppling sea hammered like an avalanche at our beam. Stormchild's tortured bows were still buried in the Genesis 4, but the lurch and twist of the awful sea loosened and prized us free. Then the gale snatched at our jib, which still writhed at the end of its halyard, and which now turned us fast downwind. I sliced through the line which tethered the life raft to Stormchild, thus leaving the bright orange raft for my daughter. "Engine!" I shouted at Jackie. Then I hurled the last boy overboard and slapped my lifeline onto a jackstay to work my way forward. Jackie turned on the ignition, and above the throb of our automatic bilge pumps that were dealing with the water let in by the bullet holes, I heard the harsh banging as the starter motor turned over. A wave broke on our counter, swamping the cockpit and crashing white down the companionway. The engine wouldn't start, and the wind and sea were carrying us so fast that already the wreck of the Genesis 4 was hidden by a spume-fretted wave crest. Jackie advanced the throttle, turned the key again, and this time the motor caught and throbbed. She let in the clutch, then staggered to the wheel to turn Stormchild back towards the wreckage. But a great sea, heaped and wind-whipped, slammed us back and almost threw us on our beam ends. Jackie sensibly let the boat run, while I, terrified that our mast would be lost, sawed with my rigging knife at the jib halyard. The cut halyard snaked up through the masthead block to release the jib that sailed away like a demonically winged monster. The forestay was streaming ahead of us, carried almost horizontal by the force of the rising gale, which now leached the ocean white and bent Stormchild's tall mast like a longbow. I unhanded the mainsail's halyard, took some bends off the cleat, carried the halyard forward, and shackled it to the foreplate. Then I went back to the mast and winched the halyard tight so that I had jury-rigged a new forestay. In harbour, that simple process might have taken 3 minutes, but in that insane sea it took closer to half an hour. Just to shackle the halyard to the foreplate took immense concentration, as the sea tried to snatch me off the foredeck and over the collision-bent bars of the pulpit. The wind screamed and plucked at me, but at last the halyard was secure, and the mast safely stayed, and I could crawl back to the cockpit to discover that the wind and sea had taken us yet further from the wreckage of Genesis 4, which was now totally lost in the white hell of sleet and waves behind us. I throttled the engine to full, brutal power, and, cursing the bitch of a sea that fought us, I thrust Stormchild straight into the throat of Cape Horn's malevolence. It took us an hour to find the wreckage of Genesis 4, and even then we discovered nothing but scraps, an oar that still had the name Naiad burnt into its blade, a plastic bottle, a sail bag, a broken pencil. We found Stormchild's life raft, but there was no one inside. We circled the pathetic wreckage, enduring the shrieking wind and the flogging seas and the fiendish rain. But though we found lumps of foam torn from the catamaran's hulls, and though we found our lifebuoys, we could not find Nicole, or any of Nicole's crew. My daughter was gone. She was drowned. She was gone to the cleansing sea, and it had been I who had killed her. And it was I who now wept for her. As a small child, Nicole had been graceful. She had grown up willful, but Joanna and I had been proud of her. We had loved her, and we had thought that our old age would be blessed by her. But then her brother had been killed by terrorists, and Nicole, as if to even the score, had become a terrorist herself. Her cause was different from the cause of those men who had murdered her brother, but her evil was the same, and now she was dead. At last I turned Stormchild away from Nicole's killing place. A new black squall of sleet and rain clawed across the broken water to overtake and drive us eastwards. I set the storm jib on the staysail halyard, and then we ran the shattering seas of the Horn in a full gale that blew us through the night, so that it was full darkness as we struck the first Atlantic waves and turned our scarred and battered bows north towards the Falklands. Jackie shared the night watch, huddled beside me in the cockpit, not talking, but just watching the skirl and rush of the seething waters. And in the dawn, as the tired wind calmed, we saw that the sea was weeping.